The prisoner who captivated an author. Before we begin, hit subscribe, because this story will make you question everything you believe about redemption, intellect, and trust. Inside a cold cell in Marion Federal Penitentiary, a man named Jack Henry Abbott sat under dim light, writing letters that would one day shock the literary world. The year was 1978, and Abbott was no ordinary inmate. He was a career criminal who had spent most of his life behind bars. Armed robbery, forgery, assault. His record was long and violent. Yet, in his letters, he sounded nothing like a hardened convict. He wrote with the precision of a scholar and the fire of a philosopher. His words were poetic, raw, and unsettlingly intelligent. Those letters were sent to Norman Mailer, one of America's most famous writers at the time, a man fascinated by the dark corners of the human mind. Mailer had been working on a book about Gary Gilmore, another convicted killer, when Abbott reached out to him, claiming to understand prison life better than anyone else. Mailer was captivated. Abbott wrote about the inhumanity of prisons, the cruelty of guards, and the hopelessness that consumed inmates. His letters painted him as a victim of a system that never gave second chances. Over time, Mailer became convinced that Abbott was not just a prisoner, but a brilliant mind trapped behind bars. Their correspondence grew into a friendship, and Mailer began to publicly advocate for Abbott's release. He used his influence in New York's literary circles to publish Abbott's writings, which were soon turned into a book titled In the Belly of the Beast. The book was an instant success. Critics hailed it as raw and revolutionary, a glimpse into the soul of the American prison system. To many, Abbott became a symbol of hope, proof that even a man with a violent past could find redemption through words. But behind the praise and literary fame, there was a darkness Mailer and his supporters couldn't see. Abbott wasn't rehabilitated. He was a master manipulator, and soon, the world would learn that letting him out of prison was a decision that would end in blood. When Jack Henry Abbott walked out of prison in June 1981, he didn't just step into freedom. He stepped into the spotlight. The literary world had embraced him. Critics called him a voice of truth from inside America's darkest walls. Newspapers praised Norman Mailer for championing his release, and Abbott suddenly found himself at elegant Manhattan dinners surrounded by writers, intellectuals, and journalists who spoke to him like an equal or even a genius. For a man who had spent most of his life locked away, the world outside was intoxicating. He appeared on talk shows, signed book copies, and spoke about prison reform as if he were a survivor turned philosopher. But beneath the polished surface, his violent temper was still there, waiting. Those closest to him began to notice flashes of it. A careless comment could make his face twist with anger. He would lash out verbally, feeling that people were talking down to him, treating him like a project instead of a man. Inside, Abbott wasn't healed. He was simmering with resentment. His charm fooled everyone. The same intellect that had impressed Mailer now helped him manipulate those around him. He spoke with confidence about redemption, but behind closed doors, he struggled to control his impulses. He drank heavily, stayed out late, and drifted to the nightlife of New York, still clinging to the paranoia of a man who had spent decades in confinement. Then, on July 18, 1981, only 6 weeks after his release, the illusion shattered. Abbott was having breakfast at a small restaurant on 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. A waiter named Richard Adon, a 22-year-old aspiring actor, told Abbott the restroom was for staff only. The comment, simple, polite, ignited something in him. Years of anger, humiliation, and distrust boiled over in a single, uncontrollable moment. Something in him. Years of anger, humiliation, and distrust boiled over in a single, uncontrollable moment. Abbott lunged forward. In a flash, he pulled out a knife he'd been carrying and stabbed Adon in the chest. The young man collapsed instantly. Witnesses screamed as Abbott fled into the night. By the time police arrived, Abbott was gone. News spread like wildfire. Paroled author kills man in New York. The headlines were everywhere. The man once celebrated as a symbol of reform was now a murderer once again. Norman Mailer, horrified, went silent. His campaign to prove that intellect could save a criminal had backfired in the worst way imaginable. For days, Abbott evaded capture, sleeping in abandoned buildings and hiding in cheap motels. But fame couldn't protect him anymore, only expose him. When police finally caught him in Louisiana 6 weeks later, the press cameras were waiting. The man once praised as a literary prodigy now stood handcuffed and expressionless, eyes hollow, like a ghost of the myth he created. His story wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning, a reminder that words can lie, charm can deceive, and sometimes monsters don't hide in darkness. They hide behind brilliance. When Jack Henry Abbott was captured in Louisiana in September 1981, the nation watched closely. Once celebrated as the literary world's great redemption story, he was now the ultimate cautionary tale, the man who had fooled everyone. The trial began the following year in New York City, and from the very first day, it was clear that Abbott wasn't remorseful. He walked into court calm, confident, and still believing he was smarter than everyone in the room. He called the stabbing an accident, claiming it happened in a moment of confusion. But the witnesses, the evidence, and his own arrogance painted a different story. Reporters packed the courtroom. Cameras flashed as prosecutors described how a man hailed as a reformed thinker had reverted to violence within weeks of parole. The jury listened as psychiatrists debated whether Abbott's mind was driven by rage, paranoia, or simply evil. At one point, Abbott interrupted the proceedings to lecture the court on society, power, and oppression, the same subjects that had impressed Norman Mailer years earlier. But this time, no one was charmed. The illusion had shattered. The courtroom saw not a poet, but a manipulator who used words as weapons. In 1982, the verdict came: guilty of manslaughter, sentenced to 15 years to life. For many, it was far less than he deserved. For others, it was justice, the kind that finally caught up with a man who had been escaping accountability his entire life. Back behind bars, Abbott returned to writing. He continued to send letters, essays, and angry critiques of the system that had once set him free. But the world had moved on. Publishers stopped printing his work. Mailer, haunted by guilt, later admitted, "We thought we were helping a man find his humanity, but we only gave him the chance to destroy someone else's." Years passed. The fame faded. The letters stopped, and Abbott became what he always had been, a prisoner. On February 10th, 2002, guards at Winnie Correctional Facility in New York found Abbott dead in his cell. He had taken his own life. On the wall beside him were a few lines scribbled in pencil, angry, disjointed, and defiant to the end. His death closed one of the most controversial chapters in American criminal history. But the questions he raised still linger. How far should compassion go? Can intellect disguise evil? And how many times has charisma blinded us to the truth? Jack Henry Abbott's story is a chilling reminder that not every mind behind bars is misunderstood. Some are simply waiting for the right audience to believe them. He was a man who turned words into weapons, fooled the system, and left behind a legacy that blurred the line between genius and monster. And in the end, it wasn't justice or redemption that defined him. It was the truth he spent his life trying to outrun. Truth he spent his life trying to outrun.